In a world where your bloodline decides your worth, a former slave became the greatest swordsman alive. Even then, he couldn't stop humanity from falling. Moments before his death, he gains the one thing he never had, the power of magic. Thrown back into the past, he enters a noble family determined to shatter a world obsessed with bloodlines. Can the boy everyone looks down on rise to the very top and prove that strength is earned, not inherited? The story began in the city of Isle, humanity's last stronghold. Fire raged everywhere. Explosions thundered from all sides, shattering the remnants of its former defenses. The protagonist, Colin, lay amidst the rubble and exhaled through clenched teeth. Damn. He breathed heavily, feeling each breath cause pain in his chest. A demon emerged from a breach in the ruined wall. Grinning, it declared, "He is the last one standing, Colin." And then it pointed a blazing sword of fire at him. Colin struggled to his feet, pressing his hand to his chest. He frowned at his opponent. The demon tilted its head to the side and said, he continued to fight even when he was left alone. For that, it would allow him to choose how he died. Colin gritted his teeth and thought, is this really the end? Memories flashed before his eyes. A year ago, demons had suddenly launched an invasion. In the blink of an eye, they had captured numerous cities, including the royal capital. The commoner soldiers resisted fiercely, but fell before the creatures wielding magic. For humanity, magic was a privilege reserved for nobles of distinguished lineage. Obsessed with the idea of blood superiority, the nobles believed they would be the heroes who would save humanity. They could never have imagined that their magic was nothing more than child's play for demons. Colin gripped the hilt of his sword again and whispered silently, if only he had received this book earlier, everything would have turned out differently. The demon lazily shrugged and asked, had he already decided which method of death would be preferable to him? He could cut off his limbs or burn them, like his comrades. Neither was a bad option. Colin gloomily noted to himself, he talks too much. And out loud, he muttered, since it had come to this, he had no choice. He reached for the sword lying on the ground nearby and barked, stop talking! Shut up! With a shout, he charged. Their blades clashed with a deafening clang. The demon raised an eyebrow. Oh, Colin screamed, parrying the furious blows, then abruptly thrust his blade forward, aiming for the demon's chest. He was forced to take a step back. The demon asked, did he really think he could defeat him with swordsmanship alone? Humanity, deprived of the demon god's blessing, is doomed. But the next second, deep, slashing wounds began to appear on his body. The demon howled. Impossible. His body burst into flames as if the flames themselves had rebelled against him. He screamed, a human's swordsmanship cannot harm his body. Colin wiped the sweat from his face with the back of his hand and said coldly, not with ordinary swordsmanship, but if this is a forbidden sword, sacrificing the wielder's soul and life force, then everything is different. They rushed at each other again, blades flashing through the air, striking sparks. In an instant, Colin seized the moment, an opening, and swung his weapon with lightning speed, severing the demon's arm. The demon roared, veins bulging on his face. With his free hand, he grabbed Colin's blade and snarled, so this is the forbidden sword? Still smirking, he added, the result might have been different if he had attacked suddenly using this technique. Colin glanced at his sword. It was beginning to crack, as if unable to withstand its own power. The demon, without losing his composure, muttered, but unfortunately, he was just one step short. With these words, with one sharp movement, he turned Colin's blade into a scattering of small shards that scattered across the ground. Then he raised his hand, pointing it at the hero, and roared, die! A powerful flash of energy struck the ruins. Colin collapsed to the ground, feeling his strength draining. He frowned and thought, even this wasn't enough. The demon leaned over him and said, he doesn't know where he got this technology, but one way or another, this is the end for humanity. He grabbed Colin by the neck and lifted him off the ground. Colin mentally said goodbye to his comrades. He fought with all his might, but the most he achieved was cutting off one arm. That wasn't enough. The next moment, the demon froze, as if sensing something, and Colin, almost losing consciousness, suddenly opened an eye in surprise. Why was he still alive? Where was he even? And then he heard a voice, Colin. He jerked sharply, looking around. Who was there? Nearby was a glowing book, a grimoire. The voice sounded again. His blood awakened him. It would help him return to the past and start over. Colin stared at the book, a spark of hope flaring in his chest. He thought, start all over again. Clenching his fist, he said hoarsely, he doesn't know who he is, but if he can truly give him another chance, it's more than he could ever dream of. The grimoire responded quietly, wonderful. From now on, he will be by his side. He will help you master magic and fulfill his long-held wish. The pages of the book began to turn of their own accord. The grimoire added, it must show him a different future, Colin. This time, they will do everything differently. After some time, the chant of Butcher rolled over the arena again and again. The crowd did not stop, chanting the name of the huge fighter, as if elevating him to the rank of legend. The protagonist stood behind the butcher, stunned, looking around the arena and thought, an arena of slaves? He looked down at his hands. They held a sword and a shield. Then he turned his gaze to the butcher and thought briefly, I see. The crowd continued to rage, shouting the giant's name. One of the spectators exclaimed, this man didn't fall even after the butcher's blow. What a fight! The commoners were delighted. Not like these exhibition performances at the behest of Slate. Slate, a nobleman of the Rhine territory, leisurely stroked his mustache and said coldly, precisely, the role of these commoners is no different from that of slaves. After all, both exist only for their amusement. They are mere pawns. At that moment, the butcher drags onto the arena sand with a dull thud, and the crowd erupted in joyful shouts, chanting his name again. Darius Hall, Marquis and ruler of the Rhine territory, was watching the unfolding. He slightly raised an eyebrow and quietly said, "He knew it." The butcher's eyes suddenly widened in surprise, as if he sensed something, and the protagonist, mentally, exhaled. He had returned to the past. He looked down and saw that his foot was firmly planted on the butcher's enormous hammer. A thought flashed through his mind, back to the days when he was forced to fight as a gladiator slave. Then he noticed a glowing magical symbol on his hands, and froze for a moment. Had the grimoire merged with his body? If so, then? Colin pushed off the hammer sharply, swung his sword, and thought, from this moment on, he would change his destiny. A powerful blow cut through the air, and the next second, the butcher's head rolled across the sand. Colin landed a little further away, breathing heavily. He thought, to change the future, in which humanity is destroyed by demons, he has no choice. He must master the magic written in the grimoire. But as a slave, this is an impossible dream. So first he needs to infiltrate the Hall family, and do it faster than in his past life. His gaze slid to Marquis Darius Hall. Not long before, one of the overseers, clutching a bag of coins, grabbed Colin by the rough fabric of his clothes and whispered, barely holding back tears, "He hates to say it, but he cannot disobey Lord Slate's orders. Please, just lose. Otherwise, they will kill him." Now, recalling these words, Colin thought coldly, Slate wants to sacrifice him to curry favor with the nobles. Very well. He will use this. Let them think everything is going according to their plan. With these thoughts, he slung his sword over his shoulder, stretched his lips into a slight smile, and shouted loudly, "Stop stalling. Bring out the next opponent." One of the nobles slammed his fist on the railing in rage and roared, "To hell. Wasn't Slate supposed to be overseeing all of this?" Next to him, another nobleman, flushed with anger, barked at Slate. He, by the way, had bet a considerable sum. Slate waved his hands, trying to calm the storm. "Please, calm down. This is also part of the plan. Everything is going as planned." At this point, Darius asked, how did he like the young man's recent blow? Cornell, his butler, stood nearby and, closing his eyes, said it was a truly powerful and precise cut. Even the greatest warriors of the Empire are rarely capable of such moves. Darius smiled and added, and in his opinion, the best thing is precisely that he disobeyed Slate's order. At this moment, another opponent entered the arena. Slate said, "If you give them a little time to dream, they'll be more willing to part with money. Don't worry, everything is going according to plan. Next time, they'll see this Colin get torn apart." After a while, one of those present shouted, "Colin unexpectedly wins for the second fight in a row." The crowd began chanting his name. Slate's eyes widened in surprise and thought, what? The nobles began to be indignant. What just happened? This isn't what they agreed on. Slate, is he trying to make them look like fools? He awkwardly held his hands out in front of him and replied, "That's not it." He inwardly fumed. What the hell is he thinking? Then he waved his hand and shouted, "Hey, gather all the gladiators." The subordinate replied, "It will be done." Then Slate said thoughtfully, "Damn." Cornell remarked, "This is getting interesting." Darius looked thoughtfully at the arena. A few seconds later, many opponents entered the arena. MC thought, Marquis Darius longed for a world where everyone could learn magic equally. In his past life, he entrusted this hope to him. In the end, they were unable to make it a reality. With his current abilities, he could achieve this. But to infiltrate the Hall family, he needed to attract the attention of Marquis Darius. Simply defeating opponents wasn't enough. After that, he slung his sword over his back and shouted, "That was simple enough. Now attack, everyone at once." The crowd shouted, "This is madness. This slave has gone mad. Forward, Colin." The gladiators rushed into battle, but the protagonist easily dodged their attacks, pushing off the ground and jumping up. Someone shouted, "All three missed? Impossible." At that moment, the protagonist began to descend, and, with a swing of his weapon, decapitated several opponents at once. Then he looked at the next gladiators. They were shouting loudly, approaching and holding their spears in front of them. MC picked up the weapon that had fallen to the ground and threw it, hitting two at once. The next second, another gladiator appeared behind him and swung his sword. The protagonist parried the blow and then threw the sword straight into the opponent's chest with such force that the blade flew out of his body, pierced the wall, and covered it with cracks, right next to Slate's head. At that moment, Slate leaned slightly, noticed the cracks on the wall, and opened his mouth in surprise. The next second, MC slung the sword over his shoulder. Slate shouted, "How dare he humiliate him like this? He will definitely make him pay for this." Then Darius suddenly laughed. The other nobles exchanged surprised glances. He calmly said, "The pawn has become a player, and the fisherman a fish. His plans are ruined." Slate gritted his teeth in irritation, and the nobles immediately began to indignantly. "He acts as if this does not concern him. Marquis Darius, even though he is the ruler of the Rhine territory, does he really intend to allow some pathetic slave who dared to rebel against the nobles to walk free? He must be executed. Appoint the ultimate punishment." Darius raised a cold eyebrow. "The ultimate punishment? For a slave? Looking down on others? Is that their common sense, nobles?" The nobles broke out in a cold sweat, not daring to object to the ruler. The next second, Slate concentrated energy in his hand and shouted furiously, "He still clings to false ideals? 1,000 years ago, the moment their ancestors received magic from a god, a clear hierarchy was established in this world. They, the nobles, are the god's viceroys, and he clings to his mistaken beliefs. He plans to oppose their great god?" With these words, he stepped closer to Darius and directed the energy concentrated in his hand toward him. The protagonist, sitting nearby, chuckled and calmly asked, "What's wrong with that?" Shocked exclamations rang out around him. "How dare a commoner mock a god? Call the divine guard! Capture this scoundrel!" MC glared at Viscount Slate, pointed his weapon at him, and said, "If he really is the god's viceroy, then why doesn't he fight him in his stead?" Those present gasped. He challenged Slate? He's crazy. Now he can only pray not to be killed. Hearing this, some nobles began to sneer. Slate entered the arena opposite the protagonist and growled, "Pathetic slave, he ruined his plans, and now he insults the god. And he has the nerve to challenge him to a duel?" He concentrated the flow of energy in his hand again. At that moment, a magical symbol flared under Colin's feet. Colin heard a quiet voice, "Mana detected." He wondered, was that voice from the grimoire? The next second, a system window appeared before him with Slate's stats. Meanwhile, the enemy continued pumping energy and barked, "If he wants to die so much, he will send him to the next world." Wind currents swirled around Colin, gaining strength. Then Darius cried out in surprise, "Windblade!" The nobles whispered, "It looks like Slate really went all out." Windblade is magic that turns the wind into a blade and cuts the enemy into pieces. Let's take bets. How many pieces will he be cut into? He'll bet on 7, then he'll bet on 8. Slate roared, "Watch closely, Darius. That's the difference in power between a slave and a nobleman." The wind currents intensified. Colin's clothes ripped and flew into shreds. Colin thought, a wind blade that cuts everything in its path. But in the end, this is just entry-level magic. The system window popped up in front of him again, this time with his own characteristics. He thought it wouldn't work on him. He had magic resistance. This strange ability, granted by the grimoire, turned out to be far more useful than he thought. Compared to demon magic, this level was a breeze. With these thoughts, he suddenly lunged forward and swung his sword, tearing through the vortex of wind. Slate froze, disbelieving his eyes, and cried out, "What?" The nobles froze, their mouths open in amazement, while the protagonist relentlessly continued to push forward. Slate frantically reached for his sword and cried out in despair, "Impossible!" But the protagonist, with one sharp swing of the sword, knocked the weapon from the enemy's hands and with a powerful movement, knocked him to the ground. He placed the tip of the blade at Slate's neck, and then the system reported, "Mana detected." A magical symbol flared under Colin's feet, and bony hands began to crawl out of it. They clung to the protagonist's body, restricting his movements. Colin raised his weapon and screamed, "What is this?" The next moment, one of the ghostly hands covered his mouth, preventing him from casting a spell. Then a representative of the Divine Guard stepped forward and said coldly, "They arrived on cue." This was the same slave who dared challenge a nobleman and insult a god. "In the name of God, detain the suspect." The Divine Guard began to close in a tight circle around Colin. He briefly assessed the situation. The thought flashed through his mind, breaking this binding spell would be easy. But for now, he did not want to attract the attention of the highest echelons of power. With these thoughts, he barely moved his fingers, testing the boundaries of the binding magic. All or nothing, he decided, and then opened his mouth wide and shouted loudly, "He is Colin Hall, son of Marquis Darius. Remove this magic immediately." A murmur of astonishment swept through the Divine Guard, the Marquis' son. Slate froze, unable to believe his ears. "Colin Hall?" Another nobleman muttered in shock. "This slave is the Marquis' son?" He had never heard of a Mars having another son. Colin, maintaining a cold gaze, thought, "The Divine Guard never raises a hand against a nobleman. So how will this all end?" Then Slate raised his weapon, and advancing on Colin, furiously shouted, "He is faking it, if only to save his life. He should be executed 10,000 times." But the next second, Darius's voice thundered from the stands, "Stop." He swiftly descended into the arena. The nobles and guards exchanged surprised glances. Marquis Darius. Slate grinned maliciously, and pointing a finger at Colin, hissed, he was just about to finish off this insolent brat. Before he could finish speaking, Darius stepped toward the protagonist and slapped him hard across the cheek. He shouted, "He's an idiot. How dare he disgrace the family?" The members of the Divine Guard froze, unsure what was happening. Slate glanced from Darius to Colin in confusion. Then Darius grabbed the protagonist by the neck and growled. He thought that handing him over to the Merchant Guild would at least bring him to his senses, even someone like him. But instead of thinking better of it, he raised his hand against Viscount Slate. I must admit, he's impressed by his audacity. At that moment, Colin chuckled to himself. It's a bet, and he's winning. After a short pause, Darius turned to Slate and firmly said, "Viscount Slate, he apologizes for the trouble his foolish son has caused. Allow him to apologize on his own behalf as well." Colin couldn't contain himself and cried out, "But it was he who insulted him first, father." Darius cut him off abruptly. "Silence." Then he turned to the Divine Guard. He would have a serious talk with this youth himself. He waved his hand casually and added, "They could all go free." The next second, Slate jumped up to them and cried out in despair. No, he must not let this man go. He held his sword in front of him and stepped forward. Darius, does he think he can deceive him with this pathetic performance? He will not allow anyone to take this slave. He will finish him off right here and now, no matter the cost. Then Colin suddenly laughed and asked calmly, he said no one. Did that include the ruler of the Rhine territory, who stood right in front of him, or the Divine Guard, who had come to seize him in the name of a god? Of course, they are also included in this. No one, right? In other words, he's going to raise the banner of rebellion? Slate turned pale and hoarsely cried out, "No." He dropped the sword from his weakened fingers and hastily muttered, "That's not what he meant." Then the guard snapped his fingers and said coldly, "In other words, it was a misunderstanding." He bowed slightly and added, Please accept his deepest apologies for what happened. As for the man named Slate, they will certainly report him to the Tower of Magic. They will contact him later regarding further measures. And now, farewell. Slate sank limply onto the arena sand, as if a rod had been pulled from him. A few seconds later, the representatives of the Divine Guard headed for the exit. One of them, without turning around, said, "As for the man named Colin, he must be reported on in as much detail as possible." The guard walking behind the detachment gasped in surprise. "Does he mean the Marquise's son?" one of those present asked. "How is it even possible that the ruler of the Rhine territory has a child that no one knows about?" The guard objected. "But he is not the Marquise's son at all," someone inquired. "Is there some special reason why the Marquise is protecting him?" The guard only glanced at his interlocutor and said, "For now, he cannot say anything. They should watch the guy's every move." After some time, Darius, sitting in the carriage, laughed loudly and remarked, "It was an excellent performance." The protagonist, sitting opposite him, loudly shouted words of gratitude for the help provided earlier. He thought, apparently, the Marquise ordered the butler Cornell to settle the payment for his release. Then Darius folded his arms and asked Colin, had he been to the battlefield? The protagonist repeated in surprise, "Huh?" The Marquise added, his movements were like those of a seasoned warrior. Had he studied with a master? The protagonist lowered his gaze and began to tell his story. He was born in a remote village. After his parents died early, the villagers sold him to slave traders. However, a man later bought him and taught him the basics of magic and combat. He treated him like a true son and entrusted him with a great idea. But in the end, he was unable to carry it out and therefore is now determined to live up to his mentor's expectations, even if it costs him his life. Darius looked at the young man in surprise and then thought, so Slate's attack failed because Colin studied magic. A strong heart that does not allow the flame of hope to be extinguished no matter the circumstances. Perhaps this young man will be able to realize his ideals. Soon, Cornell called out to Darius and announced their arrival. The carriage stopped near a vast estate, then entered the courtyard. Darius stepped out and addressed Colin. He was no longer a slave. However, this did not mean a quiet life awaited him. Survival of the strongest, that was the law of this world. This was where his assistance ended. Whether he could overcome the coming trials depended solely on him. The Marquis smiled and added, he was counting on him, Colin. Then he climbed the stairs to the entrance of the estate. It was said that nobles married their equals to preserve the power of magic and the purity of their bloodline. The Hall family was particularly obsessed with bloodline superiority, but Darius was an exception. He was born to a servant. In the past, he had faced repeated cruel discrimination. However, through tireless efforts and overwhelming strength, he rose to the rank of Marquis and became the ruler of the Rhine territory, known to all. After some time, they were walking down the corridor, and Darius said, he doesn't care what his past is. The past doesn't matter here. Only power, wealth, status, and honor are important. He will give him everything he desires. He approached the door, placed his hand on it, and turning slightly, added, if he has enough ability to deserve it, remember this, Colin. The protagonist clarified, is he saying everything? And if he wants his place as ruler? Cornell cried out in surprise. What? Darius calmly confirmed, the place of ruler. The next second, he swung the door open, walked inside, and laughed loudly. Then he shouted, if he's so sure, try taking it away from him. MC thought Marquis Darius is a supporter of meritocracy. He believes in equal opportunities for everyone. This is precisely why the blood supremacists and other enemies hate him. Then Katrina Williams came out to meet them and said, welcome home. The protagonist briefly thought, even within his own family, he has no peace. Before them stood Katrina, Darius's wife, and Fried, his eldest son. Katrina said she and Fried were waiting for his return. Darius stepped forward and remarked he hadn't told anyone when he would return. She replied, wherever he went, rumors quickly spread among people. She even heard about their small conflict with Viscount Slate and other matters. A bird on the tail brought it. Darius chuckled. A bird, she said. Katrina covered her face with her hand, embarrassed. He added he would swear that her spies were simply following him. The protagonist frowned, looking around at the others, and thought, the ruler from the shadows, Countess Katrina. It was she who attempted to kill him and destroyed his ideals. Having inherited the power and all the fortune from her deceased parents, she is considered the equal of his first wife, despite being the second. Now she is plotting to make her son Fried the Marquise's heir. In his past life, he had fallen into her trap, but this time it wouldn't happen. Then Colin took a few steps forward and said, it was a great honor to be met by both of them. His name was Colin. He placed his hand on his chest and added, from today on, he will dedicate all his strength to serving their family. The faces of those present instantly changed. Someone shouted, who does he think he is? Katrina held her hand out in front of her, and turning slightly, said coldly, a pathetic slave, daring to use a noble surname. Cornell, the butler responded. Yes, she asked, shouldn't he have been overseeing the training of a newcomer? He remained silent. At the same second, MC abruptly thrust his sword forward and shouted, this surname was given to him by the head of the family himself. Does anyone object to his decision? Know this, one day he will become the ruler of this territory and will force them all to bow before him. Remember this. Fried's face darkened with rage, and a whisper swept through the servants. He said, ruler? What nonsense is he spouting this time? Katrina, barely containing her tension, shouted, pathetic slave, don't you dare speak like that. At her command, her subordinates immediately surrounded Colin. Darius sharply shouted, Stop. He stepped forward and firmly added, everything Colin said was true. Depending on his actual abilities, he was even considering making him his heir. Fried cried out indignantly, Father, what is he saying? Katrina smiled faintly, covering her smile with her hand, and said, if that's the case, then she will say no more. However, in the Marquise's estate, hundreds of servants work themselves to the point of exhaustion, and yet only a few of them have ever been given a surname. A man who just appeared out of nowhere and immediately earned the right to be called Hall. It was hardly worth expecting everyone to be happy about this. With these words, she approached Darius and, still smiling, suggested, why not give him tests? He asked in surprise. Tests? She calmly explained. He must prove his strength to everyone's satisfaction. If he fails, he must follow the rules of the house and leave this place in disgrace. The protagonist immediately objected. This is unacceptable. Fried clenched his fist and shouted, what is wrong? Is he afraid? Colin coldly replied, there is no point in him alone undergoing the tests, right? Let everyone who lays claim to the family name undergo them. The one who succeeds will receive it. The heir must be a truly capable person, not someone who was simply lucky enough to be born into the Hall family. Fried, barely containing his rage, shouted, is he mocking him? He mentally shuddered. For the first time in his life, he experienced such humiliation. If he really has to compete for the inheritance with servants and slaves. The next second, Katrina gently placed her hand on her son's shoulder and quietly called, Fried. He flinched and exhaled. Mom? She spoke with restraint. She had told him many times, a nobleman must always remain graceful. There's no need to worry so much about that monkey. He has absolute magical power. Just watch everything from above. He quietly replied, yes. After some time, the protagonist summarized his thoughts. Marquis Darius had ultimately accepted his proposal. It was decided that a selection test among volunteers would be held in a month. Until then, he would have to work alongside the others, just like in his past life. He walked down the corridor and thought, this is an excellent opportunity to study the grimoire. Cornell walked ahead. Turning around, he remarked, it seems he knows perfectly well how to please Lord Darius. The protagonist asked in surprise, excuse me? The butler explained calmly, Lord Darius holds noble ideals, and because of this, he is closely watched by many other nobles. They say he was previously taken in by some noblemen. But the people from the Slave Association insist he was bought directly from a remote village. And just when Lord Darius was seriously worried about an heir, suddenly such a perfect candidate like him appears. He inclined his head slightly and added, pointing a small dagger at Colin, doesn't he think this is too convenient to be a mere coincidence? Colin involuntarily tensed, feeling someone grab him from behind. MC said, Master Cornell, there is logic in what he says. But he understands what the people from the Slave Association are capable of, right? They don't hesitate to arrange fights for profit. Cornell raised an eyebrow. What? The protagonist explained. They conspired with Slate and were trying to extort money through bets. He thinks they would just leave him alone after he did all their bidding? Cornell thought for a moment, then made a mental note. The merchant had claimed Colin's strength was at most intermediate, but his movements clearly corresponded to advanced or even higher. In the Empire, swordsmanship and magic have distinct levels. Most people reach intermediate, a few reach advanced, and anything higher is exceptionally rare. Most nobles emphasize magic, so their swordsmanship remains at a basic level. However, special organizations like the Divine Guard require an advanced level of weapon mastery. Cornell thought for a moment, then muttered silently, had those merchants really fed him false information to get rid of the boy? With these thoughts, he put away his dagger. The protagonist calmly said, it seems he figured it out. To dispel any suspicions, he would say this. If he were a spy, he would not aspire to become a local lord. Cornell raised an eyebrow in surprise. What did he mean? The protagonist spread his arms and explained, a spy's goal is to infiltrate the enemy's entourage and find their weak points. In other words, if he were a spy, he wouldn't be aiming for the heir's position, but for another position. With these words, he pointed at the butler. He asked in amazement, his? Colin nodded. If he took the position of head butler, wouldn't it be easiest to discover all of his master's weaknesses? Therefore, he proposed a deal. He would use his position as a servant to track down other nobles' spies. In exchange, he asked for his cooperation, Master Cornell. The butler coolly clarified. He understood, of course, that he would make enemies among the nobility. The protagonist shrugged. Great reward always comes with great risk. Besides, if something happened to Marquis Darius, the inheritance itself would lose all meaning. Cornell wondered again, was he really willing to shoulder the burden of power for this purpose? He was not only strong, but also, it seemed, quite intelligent. However, this deal was too profitable for him. He couldn't help but suspect that he had some other plan. After these words, he turned and said, first, he would show him his room. MC answered briefly, he understood. Soon the butler approached the building and said, now he can choose any place he wants. The servants in this house are divided into 3 ranks. This was established by the mistress. Upper-class servants serve the mistress, the master, and the young master. Middle-class servants have the right to live in the mansion with them, and lower-class servants live in separate barracks. Moreover, lower-ranking servants are forbidden even to approach the mansions. He raised 3 fingers and added dryly, his main duties are taking out the trash, chopping firewood, and caring for the horses. And finally, he will voice the main rule. He must show absolute obedience to the senior servants. The protagonist glanced at the servants standing nearby in surprise. One of them burst into loud laughter, crossing his arms. Cornell turned sharply and asked, "Does he understand?" "These are the rules established by the mistress," MC mentally repeated. "Absolute obedience. Understood." Then he stepped toward the servants and said in a friendly manner, "He is a newcomer. His name is Colin. He is happy to work with them," and smiled welcomingly. The servants did not hide their mockery. "Colin, huh? Well, the future ruler himself." Another came closer, pointed a finger at him and shouted, "He heard. He already managed to cause a conflict with the mistress and the young master." A third slapped himself on the chest. "He will teach him how to greet him properly around here." The next second, another servant smashed a bottle and, clutching the neck, barked, "Get on your knees right here and repeat, 'He is happy to work with them,' and at the same time, slap yourself until they are satisfied." Another man stepped to the side, pointing a finger at the protagonist's face. "Did he understand everything? If you understand, then quickly begin." Before he could finish speaking, Colin instantly grabbed his fingers, with a sharp movement, dislocated his arm and knocked him to the ground. The others froze in bewilderment. At the same second, the protagonist kicked another servant, throwing him against the wall. Then he swung and growled, "Then he will not hold back. He is happy to work with them." With these words, he brought down a series of powerful blows on them, shouting each time, "He is happy to work with them." One of the servants howled, "This brat!" His comrade threw a chair over his head and yelled, "Kill him!" The protagonist merely grinned, glanced at the attackers, and then, with one sharp movement, drew his sword from its sheath and threw it. The blade caught the aggressor squarely in the head, knocking out a tooth. Pushing off the ground, he delivered a crushing kick to the face of the last attacker. The force of the blow sent the man flying out of the gate. One of the fallen servants rose, covering his face with his hand, and croaked, "Damn." MC stepped toward him, pointing the tip of his sword, and calmly asked, "Is he satisfied now?" He gasped, "Yes, he is satisfied." The protagonist chuckled, slinging his sword over his shoulder. He liked to hear it. The enraged servant, grabbing a broken bottle, leaped to the attack, screaming, "Die!" Colin spun around and with one practiced swing of his weapon, severed the attacker's arm. The man fell to his knees, screaming hysterically. The protagonist turned slightly and said coldly, "Now he's definitely satisfied, since it's come to this, right?" Colin mentally noted. For now, he'd managed to earn at least some trust from Mr. Cornell, but what would happen next was unknown. After some time, he firmly pronounced, "Open, grimoire." He sat in a meditative pose, while the pages of the grimoire flew around him like a whirlwind. He thought he needed to learn magic as soon as possible to be able to protect himself. His thoughts involuntarily carried him back to the past. When Countess Katrina married Marquis Darius, she gradually replaced most of the Hall family servants with her own people and established a rigid hierarchical system. Because of this, the already tense relations between the Marquise's supporters and the Countess's entourage, whose views on governance and power were radically different, worsened even more. Against this backdrop, Cornell, as the Lord's confidant, was appointed butler, to serve as a counterweight to the Countess. Cornell not only wielded the power to exile those close to Katrina, but also the privilege of participating in the selection of the successor. In other words, becoming heir without his approval was virtually impossible, but in his past life, everything went to waste with Cornell's untimely death. His death allowed Katrina to rapidly consolidate power and promote her son, Freed, to the position of heir. If only Lord Cornell had survived, everything would have ended very differently. Now, however, with his current novice-level resistance to magic, he felt extremely vulnerable. Reaching for the grimoire, he mentally repeated. What he needed most now was magic that would serve both as an attack and a defense. A bright light flared around him, filling the room with a blinding radiance. The protagonist tensed, veins bulged in his temples. He clenched his teeth. A thought flashed through his mind. The contents of the book seemed to be pouring directly into his mind, and he couldn't move. The pain was as if he were being bitten by thousands of ants at once. Immense energy permeated every cell of his body. It felt like magma was devouring his blood, bones, and very soul. The next second, a dull, heavy voice sounded from the light. Colin Hall. Destroy, distort, subjugate. The protagonist exhaled with difficulty. He was at his limit. Is this the price for learning magic? Then the image of the girl who once calmly asked, "Magic training? You just need to close your eyes and feel the flow of mana" flashed before his eyes. Colin smiled faintly through the pain. How good it is to be a nobleman. You can train magic as easily as breathing. Here it is, the vaunted difference in bloodlines. But this thought didn't break him. On the contrary, it only fueled his resolve. He whispered he would do it, no matter the cost. The next moment, a blinding flash of light burst from the room, illuminating the street. After a while, one of the servants turned sharply to his comrade, who was tiredly wiping his face with his sleeve, and barked, "Hey, it's that same brat!" MC entered the room, casually throwing his hands behind his head, and drawled, "And the elders get up early." He chuckled to himself. Honestly, he even expected them to try to stab him in his sleep, although it wouldn't have helped them anyway. Glancing at the system window that suddenly appeared before his eyes, he chuckled with satisfaction. It worked out well. His body ached from the tension. The night's training had exhausted him to the limit. He decided that first he needed to eat. Meanwhile, a sharp shout rang out from outside. "Make way!" The man pushed forward and shouted, "Hey!" His gaze fell on a servant standing in the middle of the aisle, holding a bucket of water. Without breaking stride, the man abruptly punched the servant in the chest. He barked, "Don't you dare stand there in the middle of the road like a statue." The bucket slipped from his weakened fingers and toppled over with a crash. A few drops of water splashed forward, landing directly on the shoes of Lias, who was standing nearby. Lias stared indignantly at his dirty shoes, and his colleague immediately shouted, "How dare he dirty the deputy's boots?" Lias merely waved his hand and calmly said, "Okay, calm down." The servant immediately fell to his knees and began babbling. "He's so sorry. He wasn't looking where he was going. Please, he's asking for forgiveness." Lias stopped next to him, put his hand on his shoulder and said, "Well, if he wasn't looking, nothing can be done." The young man, looking at him with eyes full of fear, thanked him profusely. But then Lias leaned slightly towards him and quietly added, "However, if his eyes don't see where he needs to look, then maybe he doesn't need to at all, right?" With these words, he jerked forward abruptly, and a loud cry of pain rang out. The servant standing nearby gasped and whispered in horror, "Poor guy." At that very second, the man barked, "What are you staring at? Everyone on your knees." In the blink of an eye, all the servants fell to their knees. Only the protagonist walked past calmly, as if nothing had happened, muttering under his breath, "I wonder what they can eat here. Although with his rank, they won't give you anything normal anyway." Then one of the servants raised his hand and shouted, "Big brother," and showed off his bandaged hands. Turning to Lias, he began to wail, "This is the same brat who chopped off his hands. He attacked him in the middle of the night. He's definitely crazy. He asks him to be careful with him." Lias immediately called out to the protagonist, "Hey, little one." Colin turned slightly and drawled with a lazy grin, "What, his elder's friend? Does he want him to chop off his hands too?" The man standing nearby licked a drop of blood from the back of his hand and muttered, "What an insolent idiot. He has no idea who he's dealing with. Not like this soft master or mistress. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Would he cut off his own hand or help?" Several guards immediately gathered around him, clenching their fists and narrowing their eyes unkindly. MC leisurely reached for the hilt of his weapon and calmly said, "In that case, he would also give them a choice. What did they want to save? Their hands or their heads?" Lias waved his hand casually and muttered, "Unfortunately for him, they wouldn't stoop to fighting someone of his level. Better to let others deal with this guy." He was, after all, a former champion of the slave arena. At that moment, Dak, the guard's reserve warrior, a mid-ranking servant, stepped forward. Colin thought in surprise, it was incredible how they could meet in such a place. He frowned, mentally returning to his past life, when he and Dak walked side by side. And yet, just a second ago, these guys were beating him up. The protagonist, without taking his eyes off Dak, asked coldly, "Is he really going to fight in his place?" Then, he pointed his weapon at Colin and declared, "There are strict rules here. The young obey their elders, and the low obey the middle. Anyone who breaks them must be punished." The protagonist grimaced contemptuously. Would he simply swallow it, even if he were being used like this? Dak clenched his teeth, barely containing his irritation. Without giving him a chance to say a word, Colin lunged forward and shouted, "He will blow such rules to smithereens," and at the same moment put the tip of his sword to his throat. The other guards froze in shock. What did he say? When did he have time? Dak was momentarily stunned. He snatched his sword in a split second, and stared in amazement at his empty hand. Then Lias roared, "Does he even understand who he is? He was personally chosen by Lord Freed, a divine messenger, and granted him divine favor. If he goes against him, he'll make an enemy of Lord Freed and all his supporters." Colin slowly glanced around the assembled group, then lowered his sword, and Lias said coldly, "It seems he's beginning to understand, but that doesn't mean he'll just let him go. But not before he beats him half to death." The next second, he barely nodded to his allies. They rushed forward with lightning speed, leaving deep gashes on Dak's back. The protagonist looked around grimly, and Lias shouted, "He'll have to teach his own a lesson too, not to let their guard down." Dak collapsed to the ground, trembling all over. One of the attackers stabbed his sword into his hand and barked, "He's nothing but trash." Grabbing him by the hair, he hissed, "He just missed a great opportunity. Listen carefully. If he screws up again, he's dead." But before he could finish speaking, MC leaped into action, cutting down two opponents with one sharp swing. Lias grinned predatorily at that moment and thought, he's opened himself up. Sneaking up behind the protagonist, he raised his weapon and shouted, "Don't turn your back on the enemy, newbie." However, Colin immediately spun around and blocked the blow perfectly. Lias, barely holding on to the broken piece of his weapon, gasped in shock. His sword? MC pointed the tip at him and coldly threw it. Next time, it wouldn't be just a warning. Lias raised his hands in fear, "Stop," and closed his eyes, expecting a blow. But the next second, Dax suddenly appeared in front of Colin, holding his blade out in front of him. Their gazes met, and in that silence, a new, sharp tension flared. Dak lunged forward, but the protagonist easily jumped back, keeping his distance. Dak shouted, "He must not commit any more crimes." The MC replied coldly, "This time he will let him go, for his sake. But don't expect it to be like this forever. If he has understood everything, get out of here immediately." Then Colin came closer to Dak and quietly asked, even though he was stronger than him, why didn't he even try to resist? Dak chuckled bitterly and barked, "Now that the deputy has taken matters into his own hands, he's finished. What's the point of explaining anything to someone who's about to die?" He threw his sword at Colin's feet and added, "He can keep it. It only brings bad luck anyway." The next second, Lias grabbed Dak by the neck and forcefully plunged him into a barrel of water. He screamed, "He's an idiot. He was humiliated just because he stood there and did nothing." "Dak, gasping for breath, began babbling words of apology. Lias abruptly threw him aside and barked, "Damn it, get lost." One of his subordinates immediately stepped forward and asked, "He's not gonna let this idiot go so easily, is he?" Lias smiled predatorily. "Of course not. Let everyone know. He's declared war on the upper class. They will strip him of any position in the estate and completely isolate him." The subordinate replied, "It will be done, sir." Dak froze for a moment, remembering Colin's question. Why wasn't he resisting? Sometime later, dinner began. The servants lined up and chanted a prayer in chorus. "O Supreme God, they swear to serve him for life. Eternal peace to the God and his messengers." The butler, standing at the head of the hall, said calmly, "Well then, let's eat." The maids below whispered quietly. Last night she dreamed that her mistress promoted her to the rank of highest servant. The girl next to her enthusiastically echoed, "So her prayers reached the god. The mistress conveyed his will through her. Now she'll have to work even harder." They bowed their heads again and quietly repeated, "Eternal rest to God and his messengers." The cook, pouring soup into bowls, barked, "Be grateful you even became a servant. Work hard, so that one day you will be chosen by God himself." The next servant, accepting a bowl, obediently muttered, "Eternal rest to God and his messengers." The cook barked, "Next." At that moment, the protagonist calmly walked past the line. The servants immediately began to whisper, "Is this the same guy?" Colin, paying no attention, stepped forward and muttered, "Why is everyone looking at him like that?" He reached for the bowl of soup, as if it were the most ordinary thing. But before he could touch the dish, the cook instantly snatched the plate from under his hand and barked, "He who does not work shall not eat." The MC turned in surprise at the crowd of servants standing frozen behind him, then silently moved on. Those remaining in line exchanged glances and whispered, "Where did he go?" "Bear, of course." Shouts immediately rang out, "Hey, who is he?" One of the servants muttered, "Only high servants are allowed in there." But the protagonist only raised his voice slightly. "He's begging for forgiveness. Let him through." The servants began to buzz indignantly. What is this slave even thinking of? Someone, do something to him. Meanwhile, Colin calmly bit off a piece of croissant as if nothing had happened. At that very moment, Cornell approached him and quietly called out, "Usually, only high servants are allowed in here." Someone from the crowd shouted, "Master Cornell, please punish him properly." The butler calmly shook his head. Mistakes are inevitable when a person has just arrived. He must go with him. He turned and walked away, and Colin followed him. The other servants simply stared after them, confused. After a while, Cornell stopped and asked, had he forgotten the rule of absolute obedience to his superiors? MC, walking behind, calmly replied, "But Lord Darius said he would reward according to his abilities. He has enough strength to earn a proper meal." Cornell nodded slightly. He had decided to accept his earlier offer. From now on, he would assist him in his daily affairs. In exchange, he must help him identify a spy hiding in this house. The protagonist raised an eyebrow in surprise. The signal to hunt. Why was the Lord planning to begin so early? The butler explained cautiously. More likely, it would be an investigation during the hunt. Reports came in of something strange happening in the nearby, dark, deep forest. Colin finished the rest of his croissant, wiped his face with his sleeve, and quietly said, "A dark, deep forest then." After a while, a red-eyed black deer cautiously moved its head from side to side, listening to every rustle. The next second, 3 arrows pierced its body with lightning speed. The protagonist, hiding behind the bushes, held a bow in his hands. He chuckled faintly, then emerged from hiding and calmly said, "Gotcha." As he began to butcher the carcass, he suddenly froze and grunted in surprise. From the deer's chest, he extracted the shimmering core of the monster. Such cores were usually made into jewelry, for example pendants or necklaces. But according to the grimoire, they could also be used to create potions, as well as special items that enhance abilities. The properties of the core directly depended on the type and rank of the slain monster. Colin looked at the core and thought, this is low level, good enough for a mana potion. Then he glanced briefly at the pop-up system window. Shortly before, Cornell, frowning slightly, asked, does he want to go to the hunting grounds? But immediately after the anomaly, entry is allowed only to guards, elite knights, or authorized persons. The protagonist thoughtfully rubbed his chin and said, so if he goes with one of the guards, he will be able to enter, right? In the present, an enraged Dak jumped up to him, pointing a finger at him, shouting, he told him not to go alone. Besides, only nobles and servants of mid-rank and above are allowed to hunt. The protagonist looked at him calmly, then extended his hand. Give me a second. Without waiting for an answer, he took Dak's sword, and the next moment plunged it into the deer's body. Turning slightly, he said, there, now this is his prey. Dak clenched his fists. Did he seriously think such logic would work? He was paired with an inferior. It was simply a mockery. He thrust the sword even deeper and muttered, what on earth is Master Cornell thinking? Not long before, Colin had been clutching a dagger in his hand and firmly stating, he had received a task from Master Cornell. The two of them were to go to the hunting grounds, to help the head of the family with the investigation, and at the same time to obtain supplies. Look, he even gave him his dagger as confirmation. Dak then only let out a stunned breath. What? Now? Standing over the carcass, Dak turned slightly and sighed mentally. Why him? What bad luck? Well, he must focus on the task. Having finished butchering the meat, he quietly muttered, may the blessing of God be with them. If he can prove himself in this mission, he might be made an official member of the guard. The next second, his head snapped up in surprise, noticing movement ahead. MC had already lit a fire and was now deftly skewering pieces of meat. Noticing Dak, he waved and shouted, hey, come here. Dak froze and then shouted, what is he doing? Colin, without looking up from his cooking, calmly asked, "What does he think?" "He's roasting meat," he barked. "These are provisions for the head of the family and his men. Does he think he can just take this and eat it whenever he wants?" The protagonist took a small bite and shrugged. "They have plenty of this stuff. No one will notice a small loss." Then he handed Dak the prepared piece. "He should eat it too." He recoiled indignantly. "They'll punish him when they get back." He'd quarreled with the deputy and even took his weapon. Colin smiled slightly. "He only gets food once every 3 days, right? One way or another, he'll still be punished for taking his sword. He wonders when the next time he'll get a proper meal." He held a piece of meat almost to Dak's face and added, "Besides, who will protect the head of the family if his legs give out from hunger? Don't worry, he won't tell anyone." Dak froze for a moment, then abruptly grabbed the meat and muttered, "Okay. It's for the mission. No, for the head of the family." He fell to his knees and began to eat greedily. Colin quietly said, "He must be very hungry. So why is he simply following the orders of his second-in-command, even though he has such power?" Dak raised a dark gaze at him. "What does power have to do with it? Nobles are chosen by God. They are his messengers. They are granted divine power. If he works hard and shows devotion to God, he too can become a divine messenger in the next life." He'd gone through hell to earn a position as a mid-ranking servant, just so his faraway younger sister could be proud of him. He was asking him to throw it all away? Don't talk nonsense. He didn't know why the head of the family was promoting meritocracy, but they were already lucky to have become servants at all. They shouldn't dream big. They just needed to work hard. Colin chuckled. "What kind of divine power? It was simply the ability to use a little magic, nothing more." Dak narrowed his eyes. If he said that, let's see if he could learn at least one spell himself. The protagonist tilted his head slightly and calmly replied, "What if he told him he could teach him magic?" Dak froze, then slowly asked again, "He knew magic?" A loud scream came from the forest. Dak asked, "What was that?" The wolf sank its teeth into the man's neck, and he cried out in pain. Glenn ordered them to gather and hold formation. He turned around and said, "Nightmare." Creatures attacked the fighters and bit them, and they screamed loudly. Glenn blocked the monster's attack and thought, who would have thought that several wild animals would cause so much trouble? He killed the wolf, and the guy shouted, "Glenn!" from behind. Glenn turned and saw several monsters rushing towards him. He frowned when suddenly arrows pierced the monsters' bodies. Dak drew an arrow and asked, "Is he okay?" They came to help. MC rushed forward and thought, "Azure flame beasts. Their meat, bones, and skins are expensive. They say that if you kill even one, you can live harmlessly for a while. But the most important thing is, they have powerful cannonballs." He drew his arrow and shouted, "He won't let any of them get away." Colin landed on the ground, and Glenn asked, "Did he rush right into the pack?" MC smirked and thought, "These weaklings can't even hunt without a pack. They are no match for him." He quickly attacked the monsters and landed to the side. MC deftly dodged the attack and thought, are they still attacking? Even seeing their relatives killed before their eyes, they don't realize the huge difference in strength. Colin kicked the monster and threw it aside. The guys screamed in surprise and looked at the flying wolf. MC released the arrow and thought, well, they are just animals. He turned around and saw several more creatures preparing to attack. He quickly attacked them, and Glenn cried out. He defeated the Azure Flame Beasts, which even they couldn't handle. So easily? MC turned around, when suddenly a bright flash appeared next to him. The wolf appeared behind him and released its mana. Colin began to attack it and added a kick. The monster's body fell to the ground, and an arrow flew in front of MC's face and pierced another creature. Dak ordered him to stay vigilant. MC gave him a thumbs up and said, "This is cool." Dak nodded his head and said, "No need." Glenn said, "The two of them are incredibly strong. Who do they serve?" Dak said, "They are not direct subordinates, but serve Lord Darius. He is Dak, a guard reservist, and this is Colin, a low-ranking servant. They have arrived to provide support on the orders of Lord Cornell." Glenn's eyes widened in surprise and asked again, "A guard reservist and a low-ranking servant?" The guy turned around and asked, what was Cornell thinking sending his subordinates to this old woman? To be rescued by a squad of guards is a shame for life. Dak asked again, "Old women?" MC crouched down at that moment and looked at the small core. He thought, judging by its appearance, it was of mid-rank. That should be enough. Now, if he simply prepared the potion according to the instructions in the grimoire. A cry came from the side. "You're a minor," who gave him permission to touch the monster. Glenn ordered to leave the monster with them. Right now, the Marquis's task is a priority. Colin ordered him to wait and asked if it was too rude to call his savior a minor. Marvin rushed forward and ordered him not to get cocky. He called MC an idiot, and the girl asked him to calm down. MC thought, Marvin. Some time ago, Darius was standing near the painting and talking. Glenn, Marvin, then Sarah, and even Cornell. Colin thought, these three were the knights Marquis Darius trusted the most. In their past life, they died during an investigation in a dark, deep forest, and this caused the Marquis to lose his power. To think that he accidentally got a chance to change this fate. Now that he knows this, he can't let them be in danger. Dak apologized. He's a newbie and doesn't know the rules well. Sarah ordered the old witch's dogs not to interfere. Dak asked again, dogs? Glenn asked, so he's the same newbie who told the lady that he would become the next lord. Isn't that right? He admits, he is indeed strong, but if he doesn't cast aside these unworthy thoughts, he will regret it. MC looked at him with displeasure, and Glenn said that he was grateful to him for saving them. but they have a task, so let him take his leave. Suddenly the earth shook, and they cried out, "What is that?" Birds began to fly out of the forest, and monsters appeared on the road. Sarah cried out, "It's the Azure King." A huge monster appeared in front of them and rushed to attack. Everyone grabbed their weapons and tensed. Glenn closed his eyes, and when he opened them, he asked a question. Who the hell was he? MC blocked the monster's attack and apologized. He turned around and said with a smirk, but he saved them again. He said, "Sword technique, mountain destroyer." He began to attack the monster and said, "It's tough." The creature released mana forward and Colin barely kept his feet, but stepped back. He frowned and thought, with his current body, defeating the monster with swordsmanship alone would not be easy. He broke his sword, and Sarah asked, "Is he okay, little one?" Glenn said, "The Azure King is a formidable opponent who has killed many of the Empire's elite." The monsters surrounded the fighters from all sides, and Marvin asked, "What should they do now? It's hard for them to deal with ordinary beasts, and now the king has appeared?" MC told him that he doesn't have to worry about the mongrels. They are just the king's puppets. Everyone looked at him questioningly, and Colin said, "The Azure Flame beasts just follow his orders. They have no will of their own. In other words, if they kill the king, the rest will run away." Glenn asked, "Is he suggesting to fight the king?" Dax said, "But there's no way they'll defeat an enemy that even the Empire's elite couldn't handle. Besides, their swords are already pretty battered." MC asked, "If they don't try, they won't know, right?" Dax said, "He's crazy." Glenn said, "In any case, they'll have to fight if they want to survive." Sarah said, "But even so, breaking through the pack and getting to the king won't be easy." MC said, "They don't need to do that. An opportunity will come soon." He turned and looked at the monster that released its mana. Marvin said, "What an oppressive presence." Glenn said, "The pack is advancing." He ordered to prepare for a clash. Colin ordered them to calm down and let them get closer. Marvin shouted in displeasure, "You little brat, since when does he give orders?" Glenn said, "Now is not the time for arguments." He suggested that the priests simply follow his instructions. Marvin said in displeasure, "Glenn." MC said, "Dak, he's coming with him." Dak asked again. Colin asked, "He wants to be a big brother his sister can be proud of, right?" Dak looked down and said, "Erica?" Glenn shouted, "The enemies are already here." MC replied, "Not yet." He ordered them to get closer. "Not yet," he shouted. Captain Glenn, he needed to blind them with the sacred shield. Glenn used his sword technique and blinded the wolves, and MC ordered Marvin to throw back the enemies with a sky-splitting strike. He swung his sword and used the technique. Colin ordered Sarah to clear the way with the ghost blade. They quickly attacked the monsters, and Glenn thought, his shield, Sarah's rapier, Marvin's greatsword, he's so familiar with completely different types of weapons. MC ordered Dak to attack. Sarah turned around and ordered the youngster not to slow down. Dak wondered, what had he been talking about all this time? They rushed forward, and Dak asked what he was planning. MC replied, "The Azure King was used to inspiring fear, so if the enemy attacked him without hesitation, it would already knock him off balance. It's the same with people." Dak asked, what was he talking about? Okay, never mind. But the main thing is, even if they got closer, they wouldn't be able to defeat him with their swords. MC asked, "There are other ways to attack besides fencing, right?" Duck couldn't believe it. Just let him not say that. He was thinking, magic? MC released mana and thought, magic lines exposed, activating internal magic power, checking magic power level, restored to maximum. He's ready to use Ice Lotus. He released mana forward and shouted, "Ice Lotus." Dak thought, it can't be. He's actually using magic. Colin looked closely at the wolf and asked, well, does it still want to continue? He jumped back and Dak rushed to attack. He shouted, "Well done, Dak. It's over, dog." MC created a knight from mana, and the wolf released mana from its mouth. Colin quickly attacked the creature, which opened its mouth. Dak turned around and thought, this is impossible. He really has magic. Glenn asked, "Are the two of them okay?" Thanks to them defeating the king, the Azure Flame beast scattered. Marvin asked, "But how did the two of them manage to deal with such a huge monster?" MC replied, "It's just that the plan worked. He doesn't know what they would have done without his help." Sarah stepped on the shards and wondered, could it really be this guy? Marvin laughed and said, looking at him, he remembered the boss in his youth. Dak asked again, "Boss?" Marvin replied, he meant Lord Darius. Sarah said they used to be members of the knightly order Lionheart, commanded by Lord Darius. He doesn't even know that, the old witch's dog? Dak thought, she's been saying whatever she wants for some time now. He screamed loudly. Now he was angry. What did she say about the old witch's dog? He ordered her to listen. His name is Dak. Let her remember this well, old woman. Marvin whispered. He doesn't know why, but Sarah calls the lady the old witch. Dak asked again. What? Call the lady old? Sarah screamed. How does she look like an old woman? No matter how you look at it, she is a young and vigorous girl in the prime of her life. Dak screamed. To be honest, she is already aged, isn't she? To say, in the prime of her life, at her age is somehow pathetic. Sarah grabbed him and screamed. What did he say? MC looked at them carefully and remembered his team from the past. There was a clatter of hooves and Freed appeared in front of them. He asked, "What is all the noise here?" Marvin asked, "Young Master Freed?" Sarah asked a question. "Why is he here?" MC frowned and said, "Freed." Dak looked at him in fear, and then everyone knelt down and he asked young Master Freed for forgiveness. Fried said, he heard the noise and hurried here from the camp. He frowned and looked to the side and asked, "Are those the Azure Flame beasts? What happened here?" Glenn replied, they were heading deeper into the dark, deep forest to investigate when they were attacked by a pack of Azure Flame beasts. He looked at MC and Dak and said, if it weren't for those two who came to their aid, they would already be in their stomachs. Fried looked questioningly at MC and wondered why he was here. Glenn said they really show great promise. They would like to return to the camp to report to the head of the family about their merits. Fried thought, they show promise? Merit? He really dared to aim for the Lord's place. If his father finds out about this, he may be at a disadvantage in the struggle for the inheritance. He widened his eyes and looked at the frightened Dak and thought, I see. He rode closer to him and said, well, my Dak? And he was wondering where he disappeared to. And it turns out he's hanging around with such a guy. But a lower-class servant is forbidden to be on the hunting grounds. It's a gross violation of the rules. Knowing this, he still snuck in here with him, just to grab a piece. He's a great worker. Dak looked up in fear, and Fried said discontentedly, if his precious sister Erica found out that he had already forgotten that lesson. MC interrupted him and said, anything is better than being a spoiled puppy who can't do anything without his mother. They met again. Loser. Sarah smirked and said, he called him a loser. Glenn screamed, Sarah! Fried screamed, what did she just say? MC said, these people bow to him, not because he is worth something, but because his mother is a countess. How convenient it is to act important just because of your parents. Fried screamed, he could kill someone like him in an instant. MC said, he is absolutely right. But if he really wants to kill him, he will have to ask Mom for permission first. Mom, this servant is offending him. Can he kill him? Let him ask that way. Fried bared his teeth and ordered to detain him. Chains came towards MC and the guys tied his body with them. Glenn and Sarah screamed, blades of the Empire. Sarah said, they are a group of professional assassins and spies in the service of the Williams family. Their cruelty and overwhelming skill are such that even nobles tremble at the mere mention of them. She thought it was amazing that she entrusted the protection of her own son to such people. Glenn screamed, you can't, young master. They were sent here by Cornell to help with the investigation. Fried turned around and asked, is he going against him too? Glenn answered, no, it's simple. MC turned to Captain Glenn and told him not to worry about him. He told him to go and report the results of the investigation to the head of the family. Sarah said, this guy is trying to give them an opportunity to escape. They can't side with either the boy or the young master. It's better for them to just quietly retreat. Glenn skid and then bowed and asked for forgiveness. Fried grinned and asked, does he now understand how helpless he is? His life is in the palm of his hand now. Colin said if he was going to kill him, there was no need to delay. Fried grinned and said he had a great idea. He took out his sword and said, Dak, every action has consequences. He would give him a chance to redeem himself. Let him pick up this sword. And now he needed to kill this slave. Dak asked again, what? Fried said he would do it, and he would turn a blind eye to everything that happened today. Past life. A month after the demon invasion began. The orcs caught MC and threw him forward. The monster threw him a sword and asked, well, what would he choose? Perhaps he could let these people go. If he killed that comrade of his with his own hands. Colin looked at Dak, who was being held by the monsters. The leader asked, well, what would he choose? MC took the sword in his hands and dragged him along. Dak said that the day he was told that the old man had died fell exactly on Eric's birthday. Soon after, his mother also died of an illness. He and his sister became slaves, but they were lucky. They were picked up by Lord Darius. By the mistress's orders, Erica was sent to the Williams family estate, but the demons haven't reached there yet, so he's sure she's safe. He began to cry and asked MC to take care of Erica for him. She's always been picky about food, but you shouldn't spoil her too much, okay? And he wants him to tell her something. Dak cried more and more and asked him to tell her that her older brother became a full-fledged knight. Colin asked Dak to forgive him. Currently, Dak stood in front of him with a sword, and the guys were holding MC. Dak held the sword with trembling hands and frowned. Fried cried out, Dak, why is he hesitating? Dak turned around and screamed. If it weren't for him, they would all be dead already. He can't bring himself to kill their savior. Fried smirked and said he wondered what Erica would think if she found out that her beloved brother had abandoned her for some stranger. Dak turned around and screamed. No, he would never. Fried spoke thoughtfully. Actually, he had heard about Erica from the Williams family butler the other day. What did he think she did when she found out that the knight needed a quality sword? He may or may not believe it, but she cut down on her own meals to save up for him a sword. And they say that last week she collapsed from exhaustion. Well, if after this he still intends to abandon her, then he has no reason to care about her anymore. Dak fell to his knees and screamed, Young master. He asked him to save his sister. Fried turned around and said, in that case, he needs to kill him. MC laughed and asked again, kill him? He laughed even louder and Fried asked, what's so funny? Colin said, even a stray dog on the roadside can bark, but a coward who is worse than a dog will never be able to kill him. Why doesn't he just let them fight to the death? At least it will be more interesting than watching him sit and cry, right? Fried frowned and thought, what is this guy even thinking? He got it. He acts brave, but in reality, he is scared to death of the Empire's blades, right? Fried screamed. This is interesting. He offered to watch him fight. The guys let go of MC, and he took the sword. Dak thought, Colin, is he serious? Fried said, Dak, his precious little sister. He ordered him not to make her cry. Did he understand? Colin rushed to attack and knocked Dak back. Dak thought, how fast? MC swung his sword, but Dak quickly drew his sword and blocked the blow. He asked why. MC asked Dak to forgive. He doesn't want to die either. Dak screamed. Colin said 3 moves. He'll finish the fight in 3 moves. Dak thought, this guy. He screamed. He doesn't even need 3 moves. He'll finish him off in 3 seconds. The guys exchanged glances, and Fried thought. They rushed to attack, swinging their swords. MC whispered to him not to abandon his comrades. Dak's eyes widened in surprise and remembered the mage's words. You can't abandon your comrades. He lowered his head and stopped, and the fighters looked at him questioningly. Colin released mana and attacked everyone around. Fried screamed, "What's going on?" He looked up and saw MC flying straight at him. Colin screamed loudly, and Fried covered himself in mana and was able to block the attack. MC grinned and said, "So he's capable of something too." Fried ordered not to underestimate him. He pushed Colin away with his mana and ordered everyone to back away. He released even more magic and screamed, "He'll finish him off himself." Colin frowned, and Fried screamed loudly from the tension. A seal appeared in the sky, and Dak thought, "This." MC thought, magic power detected. This is becoming problematic. Fried, his mana reserve is 50 points, and the magic level is average. MC looked at the system window with his stats and thought, average then. According to the grimoire, each time he levels up, both the magic power and the required mana seem to double. He can't resist this? Colin asked. He won't know if he doesn't try, right? Fried screamed. He will show him the difference in their power. Lightning headed towards MC, but he was able to put up a barrier. Fried covered his face with his hand and thought, was that magic just now? Or did he imagine it? Crystals flew towards him, and he screamed. What's going on? He thought, why is he flying in a place like this? MC asked. Is that all he can do? Loser. The guys screamed. Is he alive? This is incredible. Dak looked away in surprise, and Fried thought, did he really use magic? No, there was definitely some trick behind it. He screamed. A mere slave can use magic. It's impossible. Colin screamed. He'll never let him defeat him. The system reported that he couldn't use magic because his mana was depleted. He thrust his sword into the ground and thought, what a nightmare. His body was covered with the enemy's mana and he screamed, this. Fried continued to release mana and scream loudly. MC's body was covered in wounds and he thought, is he going to die? Although he finally got a chance to live his life again. Warning, using magic when you lack mana may cause it to get out of control. Colin screamed, not in a place like this. He will not die. His body changed, and the system window reported that Colin's stats were unknown. He thought, what is this? He grabbed his head and asked, what's going on? It looks like it won't last long. Then they will finish everything quickly. Fried looked at him in surprise and thought, is this magic? No, he had never heard of such magic. What's going on? MC jumped and swung his sword. He landed and thrust the sword into the ground. Fried tensed, when suddenly he saw Colin next to him. MC frowned and swung his sword. Fried screamed, nightmare. Colin quickly attacked him and threw him aside. Fried screamed, this is mean. He thought, this guy, he looks like he's already at his limit. He clenched his hand and released even more mana. MC blocked it and advanced forward. He screamed. This is the end. Fried screamed. Nightmare. MC rushed towards him, and Fried tensed up even more and closed his eyes. A bright seal appeared in front of him, which pushed Colin away. The guys turned around and saw Darius, who said, enough. This is a hunting ground, not an arena. If they want to fight so much, let them do it after returning home. Fried thought, father? MC thought, Marquise Darius. Colin said, finally. Darius looked at him and thought, this. MC fell to the ground and said he'll take a nap. A few days later, MC woke up and asked where he was. He remembered the fight with Fried and jumped out of bed in fear. He looked at his hands and thought, he's normal again, huh? A voice came from the side. Did he finally wake up? MC looked to the side and saw Dak, which made him scream in fear. Dak said, good morning. After that fight, he suddenly passed out. Captain Glenn carried him here all the way. That's how it all happened. Colin thought, this is too much. He got up and said, his body is almost recovered. He needs to go thank Sarah and the others, and at the same time he will have a snack. Right, thanks to him too, Dak thought, so he does know how to thank. After a while, they went outside and people looked at MC with puzzled eyes and said, it's that guy. Colin asked, what's wrong? The maid asked. They also heard rumors, right, about this man and Lord Fried. MC asked, what about him and Fried? The girls screamed in fear and started running, and Dak said, what a reaction. It was like they saw a ghost. MC repeated thoughtfully, a ghost. He got it. It's because his face is pale, just like a ghost. Dak screamed, and whose fault does he think it is? Colin said, he didn't say a word that he needs to sit next to him and take care of him. Dak screamed, him. A voice was heard behind them. Who is he seeing? Lias said, could it really be their wise and great future lord? The guys turned around and ordered him to stay back, which made Lias apologize. He realized what happened and screamed, no, today he came to repay the debt from that day. Last time he was careless and he caught him off guard. But this time, everything will be different. Guards. MC looked at him silently, after which Lias screamed, why are they standing up? When he snaps his fingers, they need to attack. Have they forgotten such a simple signal? The guy asked. The deputy. He knows about his duel with the young master, right? This guy. He is a monster. Picking a fight with him isn't the best decision. MC looked at them with displeasure, and Dak smiled. Lias thought, they are useless cowards, but if he retreats here, he will completely lose his position. He saw Dak and laughing slightly, thought, even if he can't handle that brat, he can handle this guy. He grabbed Dak and screamed, how dare he betray Lord Fried? You ungrateful idiot. Instead of Lord Fried, he will punish him. He clenched his fist and reached for Dak's face, but Dak quickly blocked his attack. Lias screamed. What? Dak said he has no right to punish him. He pushed him away, and the guy asked, Deputy, is he okay? Lias thought, this brat, he dared to go against him? At that moment, Glenn's scream was heard. What's all that noise since early morning? Because of them, you can't even eat in peace. Lias said, this. He smirked and thought, they're unlucky. The little kids. Once the elite knights notice them, they're finished. He knelt down and said, Dear elite knights. Glenn asked, what happened? Lias asked to report. In fact, he was just teaching these stupid slaves manners. MC waved his hand, and Lias shouted, you insolent idiot. Does he even understand who these people are? Marvin pushed him away and happily walked up to MC. He shouted, he bet that he would wake up today. Lias thought, what? Marvin shouted, he won the bet. The drinks are on her. Sarah said, he probably colluded with Dak in advance. Lias looked at them in fear and thought, is he asleep? He shouted. Lower-class servants are not allowed to communicate so closely with the three of them. It's against the rules. Sarah put her hand on his back and said, they don't care about the rules that this old witch made up. Let him keep his mouth shut if he doesn't want to lose his other eye. Lias froze, and Glenn told everyone to go. MC smirked and asked Lias to forgive him. He won again. After a while, they were drinking and Colin said he was going to come and thank them for saving him, but in the end, they helped him. Sarah winked and said, actually, it's even better that way. She never liked that deputy anyway. Glenn said, besides, they were their benefactors. Dak asked if she also had some kind of score to settle with the deputy, Sarah. She grumpily ordered him not to find out. It makes the drink lose its flavor. Dak apologized. Glenn cleared his throat and said, actually, they wanted to talk to the two of them about something. Now only the three of the elite knights remain. So, they would like to ask the two of them to join them. Dak yelped in surprise. Them to the elite knights? Glenn said, of course, if they become elite knights, they will be treated the same as high-class servants. MC apologized, but he was not interested in becoming an elite knight. He winked at him and said he had much greater ambitions. Everyone looked at him carefully, and Marvin ordered him to give up on the idea of becoming the ruler of Rhine. There was no need to be arrogant, just because he was lucky enough to defeat the young master with some mysterious swordsmanship. Besides, the young master was not his only rival. Sarah asked, mysterious swordsmanship? No matter how you look at it, it was magic. If her instincts were correct, he used magic to defeat the Azure King, right? Marvin asked again, magic? Where could a former slave learn something like that? Glenn asked, Colin, will he explain? MC frowned and thought, so they noticed. Good thing he had prepared an excuse in advance. Dak looked at him carefully, and Sarah said that's the truth. He wondered, did they really find out something? Sarah pointed her finger at him and screamed, he's a former noble. She grabbed his hand and said, she understood right away. He's the illegitimate child of a noble who was persecuted and forced into slavery because of a conspiracy. And his true purpose in coming to the Marcus's estate is to gain power and take back everything that was taken from him. Dak thought, a former noble who was persecuted? Where did they get that from? MC laughed out loud and said, he can't believe they figured him out. Sarah screamed happily. She knew it. Glenn said, the Empire's nobles really are the worst. Colin burst into tears and said, he was originally a noble from the city of Isle, but because of a conspiracy, he was exiled from his family and had to become a slave to survive. But he won't let that break him. One day, he will make the nobles who framed him pay for what they did. Sarah burst into tears and said, he is a poor guy. Dak looked at them puzzled and thought, okay, these two are okay with him, but Captain Glenn will definitely not fall for such a lie. Glenn said he understands his circumstances. As long as he doesn't cause any trouble for the Marquise, he will keep this a secret. Dak's eyes widened in surprise and asked, did he believe it? Glenn said, but he better not use magic in front of Lady Katrina or the young master. MC replied, he understood. Glenn said, by the way, the Marquise said that he wants to see him when he wakes up. Colin replied, okay. After a while, the guys were walking down the street and Glenn looked after them. He said, the city of Isle then. Dak folded his hands behind his head and said, he can't believe that such a wild lie actually worked. But still, why did he decide to use the story about a former nobleman from Isle? Colin replied, it's simple. Isle is a place where good and bad are mixed. Besides, it's far from Rhine territory, so it'll be difficult for them to investigate. This whole noble origin thing is very convenient for confusing people. Dak asked again, confuse? By the way, he'd been meaning to ask for a long time. Does he know about the three-legged crow? He held out his hand and asked him not to say that it was just another trick to confuse people. Some time ago, MC asked Dak to forgive him and rushed forward, cutting off the monster's head. He said that such a clumsy message for his sister, he could deliver it to her himself. The monsters screamed loudly, and the leader of the monsters laughed and released Mana forward. He asked, did he really think someone like him could kill him? Dak said it would be a problem if he forgot that he was here too. The monster screamed, him. Dak and MC attacked him, after which a loud scream was heard. Dak started screaming. Did he call his last words clumsy? The protagonist shouted that they were originally too long to remember. Dak was angry, because if he hadn't turned him in, he would have been dead long ago. Colin started shouting that, shouldn't he first say thank you for not cutting him down? Dak asked again, what if the hostage had been killed because he pulled such a crazy stunt? Colin shouted back that even if he had cut him down, they still wouldn't have let them go so easily. Then, in Dak's opinion, he could have given him some kind of sign beforehand, and the protagonist asked again. Should he have shouted at the top of his lungs that he was about to launch a surprise attack? He shouted that next time he should do it, and Colin asked again. Did he mean to say that he would allow himself to be captured again? The ordinary people watched their battle and pondered this with bewilderment. They ignored the monsters and fought among themselves, and Colin screamed that he just cried and read about Erica. Dak told him to exaggerate and then showed him something on his hand. It was the three-legged crow sign. This was a life taught to him by a man named Rowan when he was in the slave association. A comrade would definitely help him after seeing this sign. Colin tried to imitate the sign on his hand and memorize it, after which he said he was already planning to get captured again. Dak yelled at him to shut up, stubborn idiot. Colin explained that he learned it from someone, but that person had already died. He was his stupid, stubborn best friend. Dak was surprised. An acquaintance from his slave days? Was there a guy like that in the association? A moment later, they knocked on the door and entered the family's room, asking if he'd called them. Darius turned to Colin and asked how he was feeling. He replied that he had fully recovered. They hadn't seen Dak in a while, so he also greeted the head of the family. Darius explained that he had called them both for the same reason. He needed to talk to them about the incident at the hunting grounds, and they realized that going into the hunting grounds without permission was a bad idea after all. He had known Glenn and his people for a long time, and they had survived countless mortal dangers together, and finally, they had reached this point, and he couldn't even imagine losing them. So Darius thanked them for saving these three people. Dak bowed and said that if they had only noticed the anomaly a little earlier, they could have saved more people. The head replied that the two of them had done nothing wrong, and that it was all his responsibility for failing to foresee the monster attack. They had already received offers from Glenn to join the elite knights, right? He would also like to hear their answer. Colin apologized and said he had to decline, which surprised Darius. He asked again, Dak, does he want to become one of his elite knights? He exclaimed and began waving his arms in disbelief, then said, what, a mage like him who couldn't even become an official member of the guards? Could he really join the elite knights? So maybe he should delegate it to someone more capable? Colin noted that the head of the family was asking what he wanted, which caused Dak to frown and hesitate before suddenly shouting that he wanted to become an elite knight. Darius turned and told Colin that if he had any other requests, he should say so. He replied, in that case, Dak's younger sister, please let him transfer Erica, the Williams family's maid, to the Hall family. Dak exclaimed, what? They didn't understand what was going on, and Colin confirmed that Erica and Dak had been together the whole time before they were transferred to the Hall family. And since she's in poor health, he's sure Dak also wants to be with her. The head of the family asked if that was his wish. Colin replied that he and Dak were comrades in arms who fought back to back and were close friends, and he couldn't simply ignore him when he was in trouble. Dak was very surprised by his words, and Colin asked him to please return his sister to him. He replied that this meant he was a comrade and close friend. Since the Williams family was involved, it would only take a little time, and Dak could go. Dak mentally thanked Colin for this and left the office. When the protagonist became the head of the family, Darius turned around and asked if he remembered the day he challenged Slate to a fight in the arena. Even then, he was sure he was no ordinary slave. When he took a magical attack and won without a scratch, even he was surprised. But what struck him most was what he had shown a few days earlier in the fight with Freed. That power, if the persecuted nobleman from the city simply wanted to return to his former life, there would be many ways to do so. But at that moment, Colin spoke up. Marquise Darius showed the magic shards in his hand and said he wasn't such a great man. He was just someone who could use a little magic, an ordinary person. From his perspective, as a great-level grandmaster, he must be insignificant, right? Darius asked again, an ordinary person who uses magic. It was simply hard to believe. So who is he really? Colin placed his hand on his chest and declared that he was the greatest ruler who loved his people and was loved by them. He drew his sword and continued to say that he respected true ability, not blood. He was honored to be recognized by someone like him. His ideal was to embody his ideal and soon surpass the blood of this world. And one day, he would become as great as him, and ultimately, he wanted to surpass him. He had saved his life twice, so first he would prove his strength and worth in the selection trial. He'll decide how to use the sword he is after seeing the results of the test. At that moment, Darius began shouting and laughing loudly, exclaiming that it was curious. Then they'll see what he's capable of, and he can go. Colin said he begs his pardon, and Darius asked permission to ask one last question. What do you think of Rowan? The protagonist turned around and asked, what? Darius asked him to forget about it because he can go. When he went outside, Darius watched him and asked himself, what did you think of this, Cornell? Cornell replied that if he really was just an ordinary man, then he could be called an incredible genius. Judging by his reaction, he didn't know, which meant he was at least not a noble from the city. Perhaps he had some ulterior motive. They should definitely remain vigilant. After all, there was a precedent. Darius thought about it after that and looked at the photo of Katrina. When Cornell pulled the letter from his pocket, he reported that a message from a spiritual being had just arrived, and Darius asked again, has it been that long? He wondered what information they'd received this time. Night had fallen sometime later, and the protagonist gathered around gold coins, materials, and medicine, realizing that thanks to the Marquis leaving him the spoils, he'd been able to exchange them for a large amount of supplies. With such abilities, he could grow significantly. And yet, who exactly was Roan? He'd only heard his name once in his past life, but knew nothing else about him. And the way the Marquis had asked about him earlier seemed so natural. But that didn't matter. Next time, he'd try asking Dak more about it, and right now, the most important thing was to gain strength before the selection. He added the capsule to the potion and began stirring it, then drank it. A second later, he shouted for the grimoire to open. Numerous documents appeared around him. He continued drinking the potion and tossed them into empty flasks. After that, he screamed to absorb it, and bright beams of light appeared around him, piercing his chest. He clutched his stomach in pain, and the system reported that the absorption was complete, increasing his magic power by 1 point. He grinned as he looked at his hands and realized that mixing the Azure Flame Beast core with the Jade Emperor would enhance his magic power. It was written in the grimoire, but even the best quality medicines only increase it by 3 points. Some, depending on the type, don't even increase by 1 point. However, if the paper runs out, it could spiral out of control like last time, and until he understands how strength affects magic resistance, he has no choice but to increase his magic power. And yet, it tastes terrible. When he drank the potion, he realized that if he drank it one by one, the sun would set before he finished, and more likely, his stomach would give out before he finished it all. Is there an easier way to do this? Suddenly, he noticed a system window informing him that a powerful monster core had been detected, and that he could create a magical tool using the Azure King's core as a material. He was surprised to see a magical tool, and realized that transforming the core into a sharp object sounded quite interesting. He pressed the button, and a multitude of blessings scattered around him. He concentrated, closing his eyes, and realized that, following the grimoire's instructions, he was infusing magic into the monster's core. He imagined the shape of the magic tool in his head. Which one would be best? At that moment, he shouted, "Okay," he'd made his decision. A magic ball glowed in his hand, and he shouted, "Create," when suddenly the monster that had appeared above him began to spread, and the bright light from the window brightened the entire area. The beams of light around Colin stopped, and the system reported that the creation of the magic tool was complete. He looked at his hand in surprise and realized it was an azure bracelet. The Wolf King's blessing effect increased magic power by 1. Its special effect was Wild Sense. He wondered if this could really be a magic tool. The Wolf King's blessing increased magic power by 1, perhaps. But before he could fully consider this thought, the system reported that his magic power had increased by 2 points. He knew it, even if the medicine was low quality, and could only increase by 1 point. If he had the bracelet, he could increase it by 2 points without the hassle of absorbing it. He clenched his fist and realized that magical tools were quite convenient. But what was the second property's effect? The Wild Sense. Suddenly he heard strange sounds behind the door, and using his magical powers, realized what it was. 2 girls were standing behind the door, discussing how tired they were today and desperately wanted to sleep. The protagonist exclaimed, "What's going on?" They turned their attention to him, and Colin realized he was seeing through walls. No, he was seeing people's energy. When he turned around, he heard the knights standing nearby discussing, "Have they checked everything?" And suddenly, through the walls, he saw Marquis Darius and Katrina in the same room. So it was flame magic. Suddenly, he heard someone sound hungry and was surprised, not understanding whose voice it was. It wasn't them or these guys talking about this. It was Mana. That physique spoke of something else. He looked up and saw a girl looking at him with her bright eyes, causing him to become very frightened and even begin to fall. To think she'd noticed him, that was to be expected. The girl's maid turned to her and asked, "Is something the matter, Lady Angelica?" She was reading a book and replied, "Nothing, just a fly in the way." It was Angelica Hall, Darius's second daughter. The protagonist realized that the voice hadn't been hers before, and it would be a little difficult, but he'd try to widen his search radius a little. At that moment, he heard that voice, someone. He turned around sharply and realized he'd found it. That voice was in the dark, deep forest. The voice begged for help, and he realized it was magical power located nearby in a tree. It glowed strongly, and the protagonist wondered if it was demons. After a while, Darius was examining the swords with his subordinate when Dak approached him and bowed. All the guys stood nearby, smiling, watching. Katrin was angry, and her whole demeanor showed it. When everyone was assembled, Darius placed the sword on Dak's shoulder, thus initiating him into the swords. Katrin reasoned that Dak, a middle-class servant, had been used as an example to the other servants since Lord Darius had picked him up several years ago, and also as a way for her son, Freed, to take out his frustration on the former slave, and he did so with pleasure, spilling blood straight from a bucket. And now Darius officially recognized him as an elite knight. Dak smiled and turned to his friends to see them congratulating him and shouting with joy and admiration. Katrin was furious about this, because the lower classes should proudly serve the nobility. She told her son they were leaving because the nobility should properly guide these inferior creatures. She grew very angry and declared that this was fate, an absolute rule that would never change. Meanwhile, the maids began fighting among themselves and shouting, One of them smashed a mug and shouted at the other that she was useless trash. She couldn't even make proper tea? Katrin watched this with ease and signaled for the new maid to be removed from her sight. The girls screamed for forgiveness, but they decided to get rid of her with hot metal. When the maid approached her with it, she pressed it directly to her chest, causing the girl to scream in horror and incredible pain. A moment later, Erica ran to Dak and screamed, "Big brother!" Katrin saw everything from the balcony and remembered Darius telling her he wanted to bring a maid named Erica from the Williams family to their home. He said it was a promise he made to Colin. At that moment, when Erica hugged Dak, she realized he had gone so far for some monkey. Freed screamed at Mom. Why did she accept his demands? After all, if you leave everything as is, then this is their dignity. Ketrin asked again, dignity? And who lost to the monkey and disgraced themselves? Fried replied that if he had fought seriously, everything would have been different. When suddenly Katrin began yelling at him angrily, "Fried, it's time for him to wake up. Only monkeys fight monkeys." She used her magical powers to demonstrate her tension, and at that moment, blood spilled directly onto the girls. Fried didn't expect such an attack, and covered his face with his hands. Katrin said that if he suddenly lost to a monkey in the selection test, they would be on the same level as these worthless girls. She killed them all and cut off their heads right in front of Fried. He turned around and looked at this. Then he said that in other words, they just need to make the monkeys fight each other. The protagonist noticed, "These are fallen nobles of the city of Ale." Katrin continued saying that for the sake of Lord Darius from the family, she will stop him. Sometime later, a feast and fireworks took place in the kingdom. Just think how many people gathered, even though these were the family selection tests. It looks like they'll see something interesting this time. He came because of that boy, right? He's the one who disgraced Viscount Slate in front of everyone, and rumor has it even defeated Fried. I think his name is Colin. Colin had a flashback to when Cornell asked him if he wanted to enter the dark deep forest. Unfortunately, entry was only permitted to the head of the family or the official heir, and this time he couldn't help him. He lowered his gaze and pondered this, when he suddenly realized that this terrifying magical power clearly didn't belong to a human. He needed to think of a way to test it. When everyone gathered, they exclaimed, "It's the Lord. Is it finally starting?" Darius stepped onto the stage and shouted that the long-awaited day of the selection test had arrived. Wealth, status, honor. If they have the power, they can have whatever they want. This is the absolute rule of this family, and it grants the right to bear the name Hall to the one who wins this battle. As for the content of the test, Catherine held up a ring and said that this was a ring passed down in the Williams family from generation to generation. Finding this ring hidden within the trial grounds would be the victory condition. Darius smiled at this and wondered if he should bring Erica here. Catherine replied that if that was his wish, she would certainly agree. And in exchange, would he allow her to approve the trial's contents? She informed him that there would only be one ring, meaning there could only be one winner. So, without further ado, she would teleport this ring and all participants to random locations within the trial grounds. She also prepared areas with various equipment and items so they could use them as they wished. The protagonists tensed and prepared themselves, and Darius shouted that the preliminary trials were now beginning. Colin noticed something was wrong and looked at Katrin's face, who gave him a terrifying look. A moment later, everyone landed in the forest near the volcano and emerged from bright flashes of light. Colin, who had fallen to the ground and realized that the ground was a trial, was remembering a past life when this place had caused him a lot of trouble. When Colin arrived, Cornell announced that the transfer had been completed. Dak watched closely with his sister, as did the other guys. Darius, along with his family members, Katrin and Fried, were also sitting and pondering everything. The guys inside the space began to destroy the first monsters. They did so joyfully, and just as the protagonist began searching for the right path alone, two guys appeared behind him and decided to pounce. When one of them fired his bow at his head, Colin easily dodged, and was surprised at how surprisingly capable they were, as his cheek had been grazed. A moment later, the other guy fell right in front of him, as the protagonist managed to return again, and a fight broke out between them. Colin remarked on how persistent he was. He realized he didn't have time to deal with these guys, so he abruptly slipped away, and the guy completely lost it. The protagonist hid behind a tree, after which one of them threw an arrow there and shouted, "Give up, little bastard. He's already finished. They'll kill him quickly so he doesn't suffer." Colin replied that they were the ones who were finished here. They should look closely at their hands. There were strange, bulging veins on them, and the boys got scared and screamed, "What's that?" Something was moving under their skin. That's what happens when they steal other people's things. That was the heart-devouring centipede he'd given them. It penetrates a person's body and tears it apart from the inside, and then it looks for its next victim. One of them exclaimed, "Damn it, if he dies anyway," and takes him with them. Colin told him to stop. It wasn't too late. In fact, he'd been infected by these poisonous creatures before, too. Luckily, he'd found an antidote. If they let him go, he'll give it to them. But if not, he'd smash this flask right there. The boys whispered, and one of them said he suggested they do as he said for now, and when they were cured, they'd kill him. They agreed with each other, and one of them shouted that they would let him go, as long as he gave them the medicine quickly. The protagonist clutched his head and replied that he didn't mind giving it up, It was only 1 dose. Did they understand? The guys exchanged glances and started shouting for each other to give it to them. This guy was going to kill him. Another guy shouted, "He's a freak. Has he forgotten everything he'd done for him?" Another told him to shut up, because frankly he hadn't liked him from the start. They began begging him to please give them the medicine and continued arguing. Colin replied that everything was clear and, smiling, replied that then he would give it to him. He threw the medicine into the hands of the guy who shouted. Finally, when suddenly his head was blown off and he didn't have time to thank the protagonist. His rival shouted that the medicine would be his, and when he grabbed it and drank it, he shouted that now Colin would be next. He asked again, but didn't he intend to let him go? The guy replied that he'd stop talking nonsense and would receive a reward if he brought his head to the mistress. He replied that he knew it, that they'd found a target and teamed up, but did he really think this antidote was real? The guy exclaimed, "What?" He replied that it was just water he'd collected nearby. The idea that he was infected was also a lie and that it was just dirt. The guy was terrified for his life and started screaming that he was a monster and that he would kill him right now. But at that moment, when he swung, he fell to the ground and began to die. The protagonist asked again, had the poison spread too? Well, if it came to that, he'd tell him that this area was contaminated with the miasma of poisonous insects, so even ordinary water here was poisonous. In his next life, let him be kinder to others, okay? The guy told him that he would regret this. The Williams family wouldn't let him leave. He spoke these words at the end, and the protagonist removed the ring from his finger and said that the gift suited him very well. He should consider this poison his return gift. After some time, the protagonist put on his cloak and continued walking through the forest alone. He approached a cave scattered with skeletons and realized he had finally reached his destination. As he entered, he heard strange sounds and passed by skeletons whose eyes glowed with a magical light. Suddenly, they all woke up and watched him. Colin said that the place hadn't changed at all, when suddenly he heard someone's voice asking him to stop. He wondered what on earth that was. A group of armed guys gathered around the girl and told her to surrender immediately. She had nowhere else to run. The girl tensed up, completely alone, and became very angry. She swung at the first guy she saw and shouted that she would fight to the very end. When she did, the knight sneered at her and kicked her with incredible force, sending her flying toward another man who swung a hammer at her. They began to beat the girl from different sides, and she fell to the ground, covered in blood and unable to speak as she trembled in pain. The man put his foot on her back and shouted for her to tell him where he was, unless she wanted to end up like them. There were many dead bodies around her, and the girl screamed that she didn't know, and even if she did, she wouldn't tell them anything. The knight laughed at her and asked, "Then what about this?" He grabbed her trembling hand and began to pull her along, causing her to scream in horror and pain. Just then, Colin approached them, realizing that this was the Williams family's trash. The girl noticed his arrival and silently looked into his eyes. They exchanged glances and he apologized to her mentally, saying it wasn't his business and he'd rather avoid any unnecessary trouble, but the girl exclaimed to help her. At that moment, Colin froze, and the guys turned around and asked if anyone was there. The guys noticed him and started shouting, "Who the hell is he?" He started laughing and told them to calm down, saying a scientist isn't an enemy. The guys asked, "What, is he from the Williams family?" It wasn't his business, so he should get out of here. The girl looked at him with tears in her eyes and replied that she knew everything, when suddenly one of them shouted at him to stop. He said he had a ring, but something was wrong. He wanted to see his face. At that moment, he grabbed him by the shoulder and turned him around, and all the guys didn't understand why he was so froze and asked, "What's wrong?" Colin pressed himself against him and said that he really didn't want to interfere, but if he was acting like this, he left him no choice. He pulled off his hood and screamed, "Don't hold it against him," striking him in the chest with his sword, killing him. The boys realized this guy had destroyed their friend and started screaming for his life. Colin threw his sword at one of them, who slit his throat with one swing and kicked another guy, who was distracted by the blow, in the face. He quickly dispatched them, and the last one remained, screaming that he was a little freak, when suddenly the sword blade was already near his throat. A moment later, the girls struck him with a hammer, and they easily dealt with each other. She looked into his eyes and decided to pounce, which surprised him. And at that moment, she struck the guy who had come up to his back and destroyed him right in the chest. A moment later, one of them fell to his knees, and Colin said that she fought well. She was scared because she thought she would be killed, and she began to cry. Colin breathed a sigh of relief, and a moment later, they laid everyone under the sheets to rest in peace. Colin asked, by the way, why they attacked her? She replied that they demanded to know the location of some guy named Colin. She said they didn't know him, but they still didn't believe them, and after the fight, everyone except her died. The protagonist was dumbfounded and realized that this sounded terrible. She asked, by the way, isn't he also from the Williams family? Is he really allowed to raise his hand against his comrades? He replied that they were on bad terms from the beginning, so everything was fine. And actually, he was participating in a selection test to leave the Williams family. Fine, now he was leaving. She grabbed his hand and screamed that in that case, she was offering him help. He looked at her silently and then asked what she could do if she had almost been killed just a moment ago. She replied that at that moment she was simply confused because her comrades were finished off. She's actually quite powerful. But before she could finish her sentence, they suddenly turned to see a man in tattered clothes approaching them. The girl asked if he was his ally. Colin replied no, and the man began growling at them and making strange sounds. The girl was surprised, and the guy laughed loudly, and she didn't understand what was happening at all. The protagonist stepped in to defend her and struck the man in the face with his sword, but he was still standing, and Colin grabbed her hand and shouted that they needed to get away from there. The man pulled the sword out of his face with his own hand, and the girl couldn't understand why he wasn't dying. He replied that they were corpses controlled by large puppet beetles. They would move until they destroyed the main body inside them. The girl asked again, "Large puppet beetles?" He replied that they were a type of parasitic monsters. They parasitized people, sucked their blood, and turned them into walking corpses. Moreover, they exchanged information with each other. They also communicated the location of their prey. At that moment, these creatures surrounded them, led by that very monster, and Colin began to talk about how persistent they were. They needed to come up with an excuse and escape through a hidden passage. And the girl chuckled, saying they weren't that big of a problem. At first, she was a little scared, but after his explanation, she wasn't afraid at all. Simply put, as long as they didn't let them infect them, they wouldn't lose, right? He replied that he'd forgotten to mention that the corpse bugs could copy the abilities of the host they were parasitizing. The girl asked him not to worry, Mr. Savior, and he was surprised she'd called him that. She replied that even if they fully utilized these abilities with such wounded bodies, they wouldn't be able to display true power. Her name was Luna. And what was his? He almost said Colin, and instead said Clark. For now, he would hide his true identity. Luna told him to trust her, Clark's master, that this time she would protect him. She clasped her palms together, creating powerful magical energy while chanting a spell. Merciful God, may this grant her the power to banish evil. The protagonist realized it was pressure. Was she an advanced swordsman? Luna continued chanting the spell so that the dark shackles would break, and the wandering souls would be directed where they belonged. A bright fire blazed in her eyes, and the monsters continued to run toward her, while she chanted a spell that would happen in the evening. A moment later, the monsters were destroyed by Luna's use of the sword technique Pure Stream. She smiled and blushed, and Colin, looking at her, realized she really had quite the abilities. At that moment, another monster appeared behind him, but he turned sharply and destroyed it. The testing grounds weren't so lenient, and at that moment the system reported that magical power had been detected. The girl continued to destroy the surrounding monsters, their green blood flying in all directions. She was determined to win and thought that everything was going well. At this rate, she would destroy them all. Suddenly the main monster appeared behind her, and she pounced on it with two swords when it suddenly pulled out its hand and created a magical seal, which protected itself. She realized it was magic and was surprised. She was thrown aside by this, screaming that it was impossible. How could a mere corpse use this? Suddenly, the corpse cast a spell on her leg and she began to be sucked into the rocks. Luna was frightened and screamed, "No," but the monster continued to use its powers and practically captured her. Luna ran to the side and hit the wall when she suddenly looked ahead and realized that they were her friends, Ren, Kaylee, and Morley. She froze, realizing they were her comrades. They had transformed into these monsters, and this simply couldn't be happening. At that moment, the protagonist destroyed one of them right in front of her face, and turning to Luna, asked, "What is this?" She screamed, "Mr. Clark." After all, she was captured by monsters, and he was surprised and asked again, "What?" The system again reported that magical power had been detected, and he understood. But don't tell him it was that monster. Just think, there's even a mage's corpse here. They continued fighting together, but Luna began to lose her strength. She fell into his arms, and Colin realized she was infected with corpse bugs. When suddenly he heard a loud scream. The remaining monsters began attacking them again, and he pulled out his hand, commenting on how terribly annoying they were. He slammed his sword into the wall with incredible force, shattering it, and emerged on the other side of the monsters. The monsters screamed after him, but he told them to forgive him and, with a wink, slipped around the corner. A moment later, he dove straight off the cliff into the water with incredible speed. He placed Luna on the ground and heated a fire near her. There, he tried to cook food, looking at his expression in the reflection. Suddenly, Luna jumped up and screamed that the corpses were moving. The protagonist approached her, put his sword to her throat, and told her not to move. She was surprised, Mr. Clark. He noticed the area between her eyebrows was slightly blackened, and her lips were also slightly purple. She was definitely infected with parasites, but her consciousness remained clear, and there were no signs of mutation. Was it all because of her build? He said this was the lower level. Those corpses wouldn't follow them here. Luna said fearfully that this was the place, the lower level. He approached her and poured some liquid into a cup, telling her to drink it right away. She asked what it was. Colin replied that it was a decoction of medicinal herbs he had collected nearby. Since she was infected, it was impossible to completely cure her, but if she drank it, the mutation would slow down. However, he didn't know exactly how effective it would be, and he brought the cup to her mouth, which made Luna tense up because the smell was unpleasant. She asked, In other words, would she become like them sooner or later? Colin answered yes, and she drank the cup, saying that in that case, she would do it. When she succeeded, she screamed that she'd drunk it all, and now they had to go. She jumped up abruptly, and Colin asked where she was going. Luna repeated, "What do you mean where?" The goal of the test was to find the ring, right? It was probably a blessing to God that she was still herself despite the infection. She had to do everything she could while her mind was still clear, and she'd also take care of the corpses, and he, Mr. Colin, would take this chance and escape from here. He replied that he would stay here, and Luna looked at him in surprise. Colin replied that, frankly, if they went down this stream, they could get out, and he had originally planned to escape, but something else was more important. Could she really bring herself to infect her own comrades, even if they were being controlled? She looked at him silently and sadly, not sure of it. Her friends had been the best since childhood, and they had left their hometown dreaming of success and supporting each other. There were times when she was ready to give up, but her fate changed the day she met the head of the family. She thought this trial was also a chance granted by God. So why did it turn out this way? She wanted to free her comrades, but she didn't want to hurt them. She was so pathetic. She started crying, and Colin wondered if she was thinking about her comrades. Tears were proof she had a human heart, weren't they? Besides, it wasn't over yet, so Luna asked again. He replied that the main feature of these corpse beetles is their symbiosis with a single mother. Simply put, if the mother beetle dies, so will the babies. Of course, this applies to the parasite, but a mother corpse beetle is incomparably more dangerous than a regular one, and it was up to her to decide whether to fight alongside it. Luna confidently shouted that she would fight because she had promised to protect him. Since she was infected anyway, she wasn't afraid of these creatures. He replied that he'd forgotten to say something, and that if she was coming with him, she should drink it all, just in case. He pointed toward the fire where a large pot of that very liquid was, and Luna screamed in fear. Was that all? No, even that one cup was her limit. He replied that in that case, they would forget their previous conversation. This made Luna scream for him to wait. Because she would drink it all, she was almost done, so he should wait for her. After a while, Colin told her not to yawn when Luna passed by some huge spiders. She asked if he was sure they needed to go there. Colin replied yes, the mother doll corpse beetle usually lurked deep in places like that, intimidating, so she should be careful and keep up. She asked again, was he planning to fight him head-on? Their opponent was probably around rank 3. Colin wondered what that meant. She asked in surprise, didn't he know? But the Empire's territory is home to a wide variety of monsters, so the higher-ups rank them based on strength. Rank 1 monsters are harmless. The red-eyed black deer found in hunting grounds is a prime example. Rank 2 and 3 monsters are those that cannot be defeated without specific skills or techniques. Judging by the response, the common corpse bugs were roughly rank 2, so it's logical to assume their leader is somewhere around rank 3, yet he's curious why a rank 2 monster could use magic. Colin told her to keep things simple. Couldn't a corpse bug simply parasitize a nobleman and copy his ability? She cried out that it was impossible, since a nobleman chosen and protected by the gods could never become a victim of a monster's parasitism. He replied, so she's saying it wasn't magic but an innate characteristic of the monster itself? Is this the flame spewed by the Azure Flame Beast or the Azure King? Luna replied that this was also incorrect, as magic is a special power bestowed by a god upon its followers. When used, it always creates a circle drawn by the god. That corpse had undoubtedly used magic before, and Colin was surprised. A circle drawn by a god. What did she mean? A magic circle. Luna decided to start by saying she'd never heard of second-tier monsters with innate abilities, and Azure Flame Beasts are 4th tier, while their king is 5th. Both are considered monsters that one must prepare to die when encountering. Does he understand that? They can't even be compared to something like the corpse beetles. Colin replied that everything was clear, and then thought about it, even though he had just defeated them. Was this ranking system even accurate? Was it possible that the corpse beetles were much higher ranked? Luna asked again. Does he think a divine messenger of the gods could have said something wrong? He asked again. Then is it a god's mistake? Luna exclaimed. Enough. He was trying to insult a god. She became very angry, and Colin, looking at her trembling fist, didn't know what to say and said he apologized because he had agreed. There was just something he couldn't understand. He crawled into the crack and, examining it, wondered if the large corpse beetles could use magic. Did that mean they were also divine messengers? What if magic power wasn't a privilege reserved for divine messengers? When Luna heard this, she said in a trembling voice that messenger-proof magic was bestowed by God only upon devout believers. But the magic the puppet corpse beetle used was definitely a circle. She understood what this meant, but before she could finish her sentence, Colin gave her a flick and told her she could think about it after they defeated the mother puppet large beetle. He suggested they move on, and Luna exclaimed, where were they even going this whole time? Suddenly, she saw this room, and Colin said he was going to use it all to defeat the mother puppet large beetle. There was a huge warehouse of various boxes and barrels, and she said she smelled alcohol and covered her nose. Turning around, she asked, is there any coal in there? Just don't tell him he's going to use fire. That was simply impossible. It might have worked with a regular puppet corpse beetle, but she didn't think it would work on a 3rd-tier monster. Colin asked in surprise. Impossible? It was too early for her to draw conclusions. After a while, they arrived at the right place. The mother puppet corpse beetles were inside. Luna asked, "But how will they open this door?" He replied that of course, they would smash it. A moment later, a multitude of bright sparks flew everywhere, and she replied, "No, not even an advanced sword technique could pierce such thickness." She smiled and watched as the protagonist suddenly managed to pierce it and said that they were moving on. But she was dumbfounded and asked how he did it with just one dagger. When they entered, they saw many torches and said, "Wow." There was water, and many corpses lay right on the ground. When Luna noticed one of them, she said this place was rather strange, but it stopped and told her to look ahead. In front of them sat a huge monster on a throne, muttering, "Meat." It was a mother puppet corpse beetle. It continued to mutter that it wanted fresh meat.